On the morning of April 7, 1994, everything at Tennessee-Memphis International Airport seemed routine. FedEx Flight 705 was being prepared for a McDonnell Douglas cargo aircraft to carry electronic equipment. In the cockpit of the aircraft, there were 3 experienced crew members: Captain Pilot David Sanders, 49, First Officer James Tucker, 42, and Flight Engineer Andy Peterson, 39, were the ones there that day. In other words, it was going to be an ordinary cargo flight, but at the last moment, a new engineer, Auburn Calloway, joined the flight. Auburn, who was also a FedEx Flight engineer, was not actually on official duty on the flight that day. He was joining the flight as an off-duty personnel passenger, through a situation that allows company employees to travel in the empty seats of the aircraft. His goal on the plane he boarded with a guitar case was to go to San Jose, where the flight was made. Of course, if only that were really the case. Because inside the guitar case he was carrying that morning, he was hiding a deadly secret that would change everything. 42-year-old Auburn Calloway had a decent background from the outside. He was a graduate of Stanford University. He had served as a Navy pilot and was an expert in martial arts. He was working as a flight engineer at FedEx. However, despite being fully qualified as a pilot, he could not stomach being assigned only as a flight engineer. He thought the company was discriminating against him because he was African American, which, over time, these thoughts would turn into a sharpening against the company. He had also experienced difficulties in his personal life. He had 2 children from his wife, whom he divorced 4 years ago, and the man had an unnecessary obsession with guaranteeing his children's future. He was not rich and had no income other than the job he did. As I said, Auburn was very obsessed with these issues of guaranteeing the children's future, and the bad thing was that while he was struggling with these obsessions, his career was about to come to a dead end. Because the company he worked for, FedEx, had detected irregularities in the man's flight hour records. It had claimed that he had inflated his flight experience hours in the Navy. That is, he had recorded his flight experience by exaggerating it. For this reason, on April 8, 1994, one day after that flight I mentioned at the beginning, he was planned to appear before the disciplinary board at the company, and would probably face a situation of dismissal. So what will happen to the children's future? The unemployment of the man who said there are no savings and could not sleep at night was in question. As such, unfortunately, Auburn's mind had turned towards dark points. He was going to do something terrible with the idea of, "You can't fire me, I'll leave myself." Although some of his colleagues said that the company would not fire him for this reason, but would only give him a punishment, he did not really believe it. As the days passed and he waited for the date when that disciplinary board would be held, he had embarked on an impossible task. According to his plan, he would hijack the plane during a routine flight of his company and deliberately crash it to get money from insurance. The aim was to harm the company, which he claimed was racist, while taking his own life due to pressure, and at the same time to save his family financially. FedEx had a large life insurance policy for its employees. In other words, if Auburn died as a result of an accident on the job, his family would be paid an indemnity of approximately $2.5 million, with today's value of approximately $5.5 million. This amount, in his opinion, could more than cover his children's education expenses. If only someone could have told him that this was very stupid and murderous, because this was a selfishness. But he had set his mind to it once. He was looking for the answer to the question of how can I crash a cargo plane and make it look like an accident, and his not-so-clever method was to kill the crew during the flight, take control of the plane, and crash it into the ground. But in doing so, he should not use an obvious terrorist element such as a firearm, because pilots shot with guns and a plane damaged by explosives would directly make investigators think of sabotage, or the possibility of a crime. Instead, he wanted to handle the crew with impact traumas, which were the kind of injuries that could be seen in the wreckage of a crashed plane. Therefore, he should choose ordinary tools as assault weapons for this purpose. Sometime before the flight, he had acquired a guitar case and placed several hammers and a harpoon inside, as if one was not enough for him. These hammers were ideal for leaving impact marks. The damage that would occur after the impact could be camouflaged as being due to things thrown from the wreckage. As for the harpoon, it was perhaps a last resort, or for intimidation purposes. Even if it were found in the wreckage of the plane, it could be thought of as a fisherman's cargo or something. It would be like this or that. Anyway, one shouldn't look for much logic, but somehow all this had seemed plausible to him, and unfortunately he was extremely serious. Finally, before the flight, he wrote a farewell letter to his ex-wife expressing his despair. Just before boarding the plane, he had transferred the $54,000 in his accounts to his ex-wife that morning. After making all his financial arrangements and updating his will, he was ready to take action. He was really going to do this ridiculous thing. Actually, a twist of fate. Auburn Calloway was almost going to be on official duty on this flight from the start. In aviation, there is a rule called the flight time limit. In other words, if the crew assigned for that flight has flown for a certain period of time that week, it becomes mandatory for them to rest. Therefore, the crew changes and another crew performs the flight instead. In this scenario, FedEx changed the crew at the last moment and assigned the trio of Sanders, Tucker, and Peterson because the crew planned to fly the day before. The crew Auburn was part of exceeded the time limit by a few minutes. Therefore, our guy's plan had to change and he joined the flight not as an official flight engineer, but as a fake passenger. This situation was going to change a lot, but he chose to continue. While FedEx Flight 705 was completing its takeoff preparations from Memphis, Auburn would take the first step to implement his plan. While the flight was still on the ground, he had pulled the power cable of the cockpit voice recorder inside without anyone noticing. This move was to disable the device and prevent what would happen in the cockpit from being recorded. If everything went according to his plan, he would crash the plane after killing the crew, and there would be no sounds of struggle in the records. Thus, since investigators would never know for sure why the plane crashed, they would assume that the incident was just an accident. However, luck was not on his side, because just at this time, while the aircraft's flight engineer Andy Peterson was performing the routine cockpit checks list, he saw that the cable of the voice recorder was not plugged in, intervened in the situation, and plugged the cable into its place. Here, while his ridiculous plan had already started by stalling, this also happened on top of it. If that Auburn's crew had not exceeded their flight times, he would have been the only person in that plane as a flight engineer, that Auburn himself. Therefore, this deficiency would not have been noticed, for example. However, fate was not on his side. Thus, he had remained where he sat silently. After the final checks were made, everything seemed normal as the large cargo plane accelerated on the runway and rose into the sky. Captain Sanders put the plane on the flight route. First Officer Tucker provided routine communication with the tower. Approximately 26 minutes later, an altitude of 19,000 feet, roughly 5,800 meters, was reached. This was the very beginning of the long route, and no one, especially the three crew members, had received the signals of the horror that would be experienced shortly. Auburn, sitting in the back, opened his guitar case about an hour later, made the harpoon ready for firing, and approached the cockpit by taking the hammers in his hand. Now the attack was beginning. He suddenly burst in by parting the cockpit curtain and brought down one of the heavy hammers in his hand with all his might on the person closest to him. Flight engineer Andy Peterson was bewildered by what had happened to him with the blow he received from behind while sitting in his seat. Then Auburn would attack First Officer James Tucker and Captain Pilot David Sanders with the same ruthlessness. The blows were so sudden and severe that the cockpit turned into a bloodbath within a few seconds. While the crew was trying to understand what happened to them, they continued to receive successive hammer blows. While a huge cargo plane was being flown, a man with a hammer in his hand was attacking them. The engineer was seriously injured by the successive blows he received. There were fractures in his head and great damage to his temporal artery in the temple area. This was a critical wound that could lead to severe blood loss. The left side of James Tucker's head also received a heavy blow with the hammer. Worse, with the severity of the blow he received, bone fragments also damaged his brain. Suddenly, he became unable to move the right side of his body almost at all. Although his consciousness was clear, the situation was critical. Captain Sanders was relatively better than the others, although it is not known how good one can be. Of course, his ear was about to be torn off. That's another matter. As a result of this sudden explosion of violence in the cockpit within a few seconds, all three pilots were covered in blood and engaged in a struggle to survive. Auburn had gained a significant advantage in his first move, because the crew who took the blow were dazed in their seats and could not respond. However, there was something the attacker did not take into account. The crew was not dead yet, and each would start fighting for their lives with an incredible intensity of adrenaline. He thought they would all be gone in those first blows, but he was wrong. Therefore, now it was 1 against 3. Engineer Peterson and Captain Sanders tried to get up from their seats in a dazed state and resist the attacker. Upon this, Auburn retreated, turned towards the back of the cockpit, and pointed the harpoon he took from the guitar case at them. But as I said, the men's brains were filled with tremendous courage on the brink of death, and James Tucker, who was still controlling the plane, would make perhaps the most critical decision of his life at that moment. After a few seconds of chaotic pause in the cockpit, Tucker suddenly pulled the controls and put the plane into a sharp climb. The giant plane began to make a sharp climb of about 15 degrees, which was unusual, and with the effect of this unexpected move, everyone in the plane was thrown backwards. Therefore, the harpoon danger was eliminated for now. Like the crew, Auburn was also on the ground. After the pilot controlling the plane, Tucker, gave the nose of the plane up, he turned the plane this time to the left. He had started to turn it so that the wings were almost vertical. Yes, his friends were also taking hits, but it was more important that Auburn did not get up from his place. The man, who was a former fighter pilot, had started to use the giant cargo plane almost like an F-16. After the left turn, this time he turned it almost upside down, pinning those inside literally to the ceiling. Everything was happening within minutes. If Auburn was about to get up, the pilot was knocking him to the ground with another move, and with his last move, he put the nose of the giant plane into a steep dive this time. While the speed of the plane approached almost 900 kilometers and warning signals were blaring from all sides, he pinned the people in their places like nails with the G-force. While he gained a few more minutes or even seconds in this way, he managed to take the nose forward again 1,500 meters before the plane crashed and bring it to a horizontal position. But the life and death struggle was not over yet. While there were almost no moves left to be made, Auburn managed to get up somehow and dealt another blow with the hammer to Captain Sanders next to him, who was continuing to lose blood, and this fourth blow now caused the man to lose consciousness and faint. Seconds later, Auburn was crawling trying to reach the cockpit pilot, when the unconscious Sanders woke up and with a final effort, took one of the hammers on the ground and brought it down on the attacker's head with all his might. This time he was the one who received the blow, and he would turn out to be more non-resistant than the others. While Auburn was lying on the ground with the hammer blow he received, the first officer flying the plane managed to activate the autopilot and immediately contacted the air traffic center. They had been trying to fight a man who had been attacking them for about 45 minutes. Around 9:25 in the morning, when the first officer contacted the tower and said there was an emergency, an attack had occurred, the teams on the ground immediately took action. Meanwhile, while the engineer was losing blood in a semi-conscious state, the captain pilot was able to come to the cockpit. While he was starting preparations to land the plane on the runway, he sent the first officer Tucker inside to prevent Auburn, who was still trying to get up from his place in a dazed state. It couldn't be said that Tucker was very much himself either. With a final effort, he went back, threw himself on top of Auburn, and tried to ensure that he did not move. Meanwhile, the attacker was still, struggling and trying to harm the man in some way. Fortunately, now he didn't have much strength left with the blood loss and the blows he received. No matter how hard he tried, the two exhausted men leaned over Auburn and managed to keep him stable somehow. When the captain pilot covered in blood managed to land the plane around 9:45 despite hundreds of possible bad scenarios, everyone took a deep breath. With the mobile ladder leaning against the front door, the medical teams entered and were shocked by the scene. While every part of the plane and the crew's clothes were covered in blood, the attacker Auburn was lying motionless on the ground. They could barely get Engineer Peterson's pulse. He had come to the brink of death due to excessive blood loss. While Auburn was handcuffed, the four men were urgently taken to the hospital. Captain Sanders, who was the last to leave the plane, had said, "We won. Miraculously, no one would die in this bloody attack." However, the price had been very heavy. First Officer James Tucker's head and jaw were broken, and he experienced a risk of vision loss in one eye. With the fracture of his skull, he would never be able to use one side of his body fully again. Captain Sanders had deep cuts and a fracture in his head. Doctors somehow sewed his right ear, which was about to be torn off, back into place. Permanent physical damage due to head trauma also occurred in him. Engineer Peterson's condition was critical due to the fractures in his head, and especially the ruptured temporal artery. He would stay in intensive care for more than 10 days, and although he fought a life-and-death battle, he would win this struggle. But none of the crew would be able to return to their newly won lives fully intact. The licenses of all three would be cancelled on the grounds that they could no longer fly safely due to health problems, and they would continue their lives on the ground. Of course, one way or another, they had survived with a magnificent struggle, and because of this situation, they would receive the gold medal, the highest level decoration of the aviation community, and the main man, the attacker Auburn, was also alive. After his recovery, he would be handed over to justice. Due to the attempted attack on FedEx Flight 705, he was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, although James Tucker partially recovered in the following years and started making flights for hobby purposes with light aircraft. None of the trio could ever return to the cockpit fully. Although the incredibly selfish ideas that a man put forward to save his own family did not reach their goal, they radically changed the lives of 3 families who were not at fault.